Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. We love to take these deep dives, and today we're looking at Krzysztof Jackowski.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and in particular, we're looking at a transcript from his YouTube channel.
Yeah.
And well, it's quite a lot to unpack, actually. So we're going to be looking at some of his predictions about, well, first of all, this small economic crash that he's predicting is about to end.
Right.
And then a bigger one that's going to follow that, and the role that Trump and his tariff decisions have had in all of this, and just the general geopolitical implications of, I mean, it's really a lot.
It is a lot.
So, yeah, let's just jump right into it, I guess.
Yeah. Sounds good.
So, what's interesting is that this transcript suggests that this small crash that we've been seeing is about to come to an end.
Yes. That seems to be the first major takeaway, and the connection that's drawn in the transcript is to Trump's tariff decisions.
Right.
His recent announcements.
Well, and specifically, he's eased tariffs for most countries.
That's right.
Down to about 10%, but he's kept them really high on China, like over 100%.
Yeah, exactly. Over 100% for China. So it's a very targeted move.
And what was the market reaction to this, according to the transcript?
Oh, the transcript describes it as, markets are going wild. There was a significant rebound, and just this general sense of, like, hooray, optimism.
Yeah, like everybody's breathing a sigh of relief.
Exactly. A collective exhale.
But I get the sense that Jackowski doesn't necessarily buy into this like initial burst of optimism.
Yeah, you're picking up on something very interesting there.
Mm.
The transcript does suggest a certain degree of skepticism
Yeah.
from Jackowski about this whole thing.
Well, he even uses the phrase like little children being happy.
Yeah. It's like,
Yeah.
it's almost like this happiness is a bit naive or short-sighted.
Yeah, well, because if the fundamental issues haven't been addressed, this could just be a temporary,
Exactly.
Oh.
A pause in a larger trend, perhaps a bit of a reprieve,
Yeah.
but not a resolution.
Right. And that leads us to, the bigger picture of what Trump is doing here. What's his overall strategy according to this transcript?
Well, the transcript points to several key motivations behind these tariff decisions.
Okay.
First and foremost, I think there's this focus on securing an economic advantage for the United States.
Mm.
It's about America first and trying to gain leverage in the global marketplace.
Right.
Secondly, it's very clearly a way to pressure China to, negotiate what the transcript calls tough terms when it comes to trade, really trying to force their hand.
Right.
Thirdly, there's a real emphasis on protecting the U.S. dollar's global dominance. Keeping it as the world's reserve currency.
Makes sense.
And this is where it gets a little bit more complex. There's also the suggestion that maybe weakening the dollar strategically could actually be beneficial for the U.S. in terms of managing their debt.
Oh, interesting. So it's like a multi-pronged approach with potentially even some conflicting aims.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a complex picture.
The transcript also talks about this idea of Trump expecting other nations to basically, show deference to the U.S. during this 3-month period of eased tariffs. They even use this term bows.
Yes, bows, as if other countries are going to, bow down to the U.S. and align themselves more closely economically, perhaps offer concessions or show loyalty.
Yeah.
And then there's also this interesting comparison to BRICS.
Oh, right.
This potential for new economic alliances forming that might even resemble BRICS.
So it's like a whole realignment of global economic power is potentially in the works.
Yeah, it's really raising questions about, what the long-term implications of these shifts are going to be.
And of course, any kind of, strategy like this aimed at gaining economic leverage, especially with China, it's bound to have, repercussions on their relationship.
Absolutely. The transcript is very clear about it. It predicts an increase in conflict between the U.S. and China as a direct result of this.
Yeah, because using tariffs in this way is basically just bringing this underlying competition for global influence to the forefront.
Exactly. It's like it's forcing the issue.
Yeah.
And making it impossible to ignore this rivalry that's been brewing.
So we've talked about this small crash that might be ending this market bounce, but the transcript keeps alluding to this much bigger event, this great crash, as it calls it.
Right.
When does the source material suggest this might happen?
Well, it's not so much tied to a specific 3-month deadline, but more to the idea that it will follow this smaller one.
Yeah.
As kind of like the next phase.
Like the aftershocks of a smaller earthquake.
Exactly, like a delayed reaction or even
Yeah.
perhaps, something that's triggered by the next step in whatever strategy is playing out.
So what could be the triggers for this great crash, according to the transcript?
Well, it mentions a couple possibilities. One is that the U.S. could deliberately intensify the economic pressure on China even further.
Okay.
Really turn the screws and try to, force them into a corner.
Hmm.
Or it could be that there are unintended negative consequences from the current policies, things that kind of spiral out of control.
Right, like a domino effect.
Exactly. Yeah.
The transcript uses this really striking analogy to describe Trump. They say that he enjoys making bluffs,
Yes.
and they portray the current situation as this, like masterful play.
Yes. It definitely creates this sense of, high stakes poker or chess,
Totally.
where every move is calculated and the stakes are incredibly high.
Right, and there's this implication that, he's not afraid to take risks.
Yeah, exactly. He's willing to gamble and he's playing for big wins.
Yeah.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the geopolitical shifts that the transcript predicts. And it mentions some really interesting potential changes in military deployments.
Yes, absolutely. One of the most striking predictions is this idea that the U.S. might reduce its military presence in Europe,
Wow.
while simultaneously building up a really robust military presence in the Middle East.
Really? So it's like a complete shift in focus. Yeah, exactly. And the source suggests that this could be a strategic move aimed at both countering China's growing influence and also addressing, the ongoing situation with Iran.
Right, because Iran is still very much a major player in the region.
Absolutely. And a potential flashpoint.
The transcript also has this rather unsettling mention of 2025 being a potentially cursed year, the beginning of a period of heightened danger.
Yeah, that definitely jumps out at you, doesn't it?
It does.
It's painting this picture of increasing global instability, with 2025 being this kind of critical turning point.
Yeah, like a tipping point.
Exactly. And this heightened risk, they connected directly to these anticipated shifts in military power and, these escalating geopolitical tensions we've been talking about.
Right, it's like all these threads are kind of coming together.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's this prediction of increased warnings in Europe regarding the potential for global conflict starting around early to mid-May.
Yes, it's a very specific time frame, isn't it?
It is, yeah, like they're really putting a date on it.
Yeah, it's just that, we might see a real ramp up in anxieties and perhaps even, concrete preparatory measures being taken in Europe in response to this perceived increase in global instability.
So is the interpretation then that Trump's actions are partly a bluff?
Yes, the transcript seems to suggest that it's, a show of strength, a way to project power and potentially, solidify alliances against China.
Right, so it's like a way to say, hey, we're still the top dog, don't mess with us.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about maintaining that image of dominance.
Let's dive a little deeper into this U.S.-China dynamic. The transcript specifically mentions a comment reportedly made by the U.S. Vice President.
Yes, there's this reported statement where the vice president refers to the U.S. borrowing money from villagers from China.
Wow.
And the source interprets this as a very deliberate attempt at propaganda, designed to create a negative perception of China.
Right, to kind of paint them as this, backwards or less sophisticated entity.
Exactly, yeah, and to further escalate those tensions between the two nations.
So even with all these risks, the transcript suggests that Trump believes that potential rewards are enormous, like he's playing for huge stakes.
Absolutely. The source material portrays him as being fully aware of the dangers, but also envisioning this scenario where, he achieves these transformative gains.
Like what kind of gains are we talking about?
Well, they mentioned things like a fundamental reshaping of the U.S.-China economic relationship. Yeah. And, even the significant reduction in the U.S. national debt.
Through these really assertive policies, so it's like a high-stakes gamble?
It is a huge gamble, but, one that he seems to believe could pay off big time.
What about China? What does the transcript say about how they might need to change their approach?
Well, the prediction is that China, which has traditionally, been this kind of quiet economic powerhouse,
Right.
they might need to adopt a much more assertive and visible role on the global stage.
So they can't just stay in the shadows anymore.
Exactly. Yeah, they're going to have to step up and really assert themselves.
So what would that look like? What kind of changes would they need to make?
Well, it could involve forming stronger alliances with other countries, taking a more vocal stance on international issues, and perhaps even developing new economic strategies to counter this pressure from the U.S.
Right, so it's like a whole new game for them.
Exactly. Yeah, the rules are changing and they're going to have to adapt.
What about Europe? Where do they fit into all of this? The transcript seems to have some concerns about their position.
Yes, the source material worries that Europe might be lured into this trap of aligning with the U.S. against China.
Because of those temporary eased tariffs?
Exactly. Yeah, it's like a short-term game that could lead to long-term pain.
So are they saying that Europe is being a bit naive?
Well, there was a critique of the EU being too preoccupied with its own internal affairs to really grasp the significance of these major power shifts happening globally.
So they're missing the bigger picture.
Yeah, and that could lead to them making decisions that ultimately aren't in their best interest.
Now, for something completely different, the transcript actually takes a moment to address a listener question about telepathy with animals.
Yes, this was a bit of a surprising turn, wasn't it?
Totally out of left field.
Yeah, but the source material, you know, acknowledges this question and even shares a couple of personal anecdotes.
Like what kind of anecdotes?
Well, there's this story about a semi-wild boar named Rudzik
Okay.
and a wild kitten who seemed to understand a phone conversation about food.
Wow, so they're saying these animals were actually picking up on human thoughts.
Though that's the suggestion, yeah, and it's quite fascinating.
So what explanation do they offer for this?
Well, the transcript suggests that a strong bond and focused intention between a human and an animal might be key.
Okay.
Like a real connection.
Uh-huh.
They talk about an experience with their dog, Barry, who reacted to intense visualization.
Interesting.
And then also observations about another dog, Albert, who seemed to understand routines and social cues.
So it's like these animals are picking up on more than just, basic commands.
Exactly. They're tapping into something deeper.
The transcript even goes so far as to say that animals might have different levels of what they call spiritual development.
Yes. It's a very interesting concept, isn't it?
It is.
It's like they're acknowledging this whole other realm of communication and connection that we might not fully understand.
Right. It's like there's so much more to the world than we realize.
Exactly. Yeah, it's quite humbling.
So let's bring it back to the main focus here and recap some of the key predictions and analyses from this transcript.
Okay, so to summarize, the source material is predicting the end of this smaller economic downturn, which it attributes to Trump's, temporary tariff adjustments.
Right.
But then it anticipates this much larger great crash, potentially triggered by further actions by the U.S. or those unintended consequences we talked about.
Right.
There's also the prediction of these major shifts in global alliances.
Yeah.
This escalation of tensions between the U.S. and China and the possibility of, increased military posturing, particularly in the Middle East.
And I think what's really interesting is how this little detour into telepathy with animals kind of serves as a reminder that there's still so much about the world that we don't understand.
Absolutely. It underscores this incredible complexity, where we have these visible, quantifiable forces at play, but also these more elusive elements that we can't always predict or control.
Right. So as you, our listener, process all of this and think about these potential economic and geopolitical shifts, consider how it might impact your own understanding of global stability,
Yeah.
and perhaps even your own preparations for the future, because it really does give us all a lot to think about.
It does.
And I think that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating,
Absolutely.
It's about exploring these complex ideas and trying to make sense of the world around us.
Exactly. And I think the more we explore, the more we realize how much there is to learn.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
See you then.